A nuclear shadow, the stakes for NATO and Russia. The world watches Ukraine with bated breath. A tragedy unfolds, a nation defiant against an invading force. Looming over this conflict is a specter unseen since the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war. Russia, armed with a vast nuclear arsenal, has made veiled threats. NATO stands as a bulwark against further aggression. The stakes could not be higher. A miscalculation could plunge the world into an abyss. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It demands clear-eyed analysis and unwavering resolve. NATO, a defender's pact in a nuclear age. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was forged after World War II. Its purpose was to deter Soviet expansionism. An attack on one is an attack on all. Initially 12 nations, now 30 members. NATO's mission has evolved over decades. The fall of the Soviet Union brought new challenges. NATO engaged in peacekeeping operations. A resurgent Russia has revived old threats. Collective defense remains paramount. NATO's nuclear posture has changed. Emphasizing conventional forces, reducing nuclear roles, committed to a world without nuclear weapons, but maintaining deterrence. The nuclear doctrine, how NATO prepares for the unthinkable. NATO's nuclear doctrine is built on deterrence. Its purpose is to prevent nuclear war, not to fight one. It rests on consultation, command and control, and capability. Decisions are made collectively by all NATO members. Command and control ensure security and reliability. Capability means being able to respond if necessary. NATO relies on the nuclear capabilities of the US, UK, and France. These nations provide a nuclear umbrella over the alliance. NATO's posture is defensive, a last resort. Committed to arms control, NATO maintains a credible deterrent. Section 5. The threshold of catastrophe, Russia's nuclear threats. Since the start of the Ukraine conflict, Russia has repeatedly made veiled threats alluding to the potential use of nuclear weapons. These pronouncements, often delivered through state-controlled media or pronouncements from high-ranking officials, are designed to intimidate and deter Western support for Ukraine. Political commentator, the language is deliberately ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation and escalation. These threats cannot be ignored. They represent a dangerous game of brinkmanship, a calculated attempt to exploit Western fears of nuclear war. By raising the specter of a nuclear catastrophe, Russia aims to weaken the resolve of NATO members and limit their support for Ukraine. This strategy, however, is fraught with risk. Miscalculation or misinterpretation could have catastrophic consequences. The West must tread carefully, avoiding any action that could be perceived as escalatory, while making it abundantly clear to Russia that any use of nuclear weapons would be met with a swift and decisive response. Section 6. Deciphering intent, calculated threats, or desperate measures. Analyzing Russia's nuclear rhetoric requires a nuanced understanding of its motivations and objectives. Are these threats a sign of strength or a reflection of desperation? Expert analyst. Some analysts believe that Russia is engaged in a carefully calibrated strategy of intimidation, using nuclear saber-rattling to compensate for its setbacks on the battlefield in Ukraine. Others argue that these threats betray a deeper insecurity within the Russian leadership, a fear that the conflict in Ukraine could escalate into a direct confrontation with NATO, a confrontation that Russia knows it cannot win conventionally. This fear, coupled with a sense of historical grievance and a siege mentality, could lead to miscalculation and unintended escalation. Understanding Russia's true intentions is crucial for formulating an effective Western response. Overreacting to every rhetorical provocation could play into Russia's hands, reinforcing its perception of an existential threat. However, dismissing these threats as mere bluster would be equally dangerous, potentially emboldening further aggression. Section 7. The West's response, walking a tightrope of deterrence. The West faces an unenviable dilemma. It must deter Russia from using nuclear weapons while avoiding actions that could escalate the conflict. This requires a delicate balancing act, combining unwavering resolve with a commitment to diplomacy and de-escalation. U.S. official. The West has responded to Russia's nuclear threats with a mix of reassurance and deterrence. NATO has strengthened its military presence in Eastern Europe, deploying additional troops and equipment to reassure allies and deter any potential Russian aggression. At the same time, the alliance has maintained open channels of communication with Moscow, emphasizing the need to prevent misunderstandings and reduce the risk of accidental escalation. The West has also imposed crippling economic sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial system, energy sector, and key industries. These sanctions are designed to impose costs on Russia for its actions in Ukraine and to limit its ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. However, the West has been careful to avoid measures that could be perceived as targeting Russia's nuclear forces or undermining strategic stability. Section 8: Escalation Dominance, Preventing a Nuclear Cascade. One of the most significant risks associated with the Ukraine conflict is the potential for escalation. Any use of nuclear weapons, even on a limited scale, would have catastrophic consequences, potentially triggering a chain reaction that could lead to a full-scale nuclear war. Preventing such a scenario is the paramount objective of both NATO and Russia. European diplomat. The concept of escalation dominance is central to this effort. Both sides seek to maintain the ability to respond to any escalation by the other side with a proportionate or greater level of force. This logic, however, is inherently dangerous, as it creates a situation where each side is incentivized to escalate in order to avoid being perceived as weak. Breaking this cycle of escalation requires clear communication, confidence-building measures, and a willingness to explore diplomatic solutions. The stakes are simply too high for miscalculation or brinkmanship. Section 9: The Global Fallout, Economic and Political Aftershocks. The consequences of a nuclear conflict in Ukraine would be felt far beyond the borders of the region. The immediate impact would be catastrophic, resulting in millions of casualties and widespread environmental devastation. The long-term effects, however, would be even more far-reaching. Political commentator: a nuclear detonation would release massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, creating a global fallout plume that could contaminate air, water, and soil across vast distances. This radioactive fallout would have devastating consequences for human health, agriculture, and ecosystems worldwide. The economic impact of a nuclear conflict would be equally severe. Global trade would grind to a halt as countries closed their borders and imposed strict controls on the movement of goods and people. Financial markets would collapse, currencies would plummet in value, and a global recession of unprecedented scale would ensue. Section 10: The New World Order Repercussions for International Security. The use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would shatter the norms and taboos that have governed international relations for decades. The post-Cold War order, already under strain, would collapse entirely, replaced by a world defined by mistrust, fear, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. European diplomat. The international community would be irrevocably divided, with countries forced to choose sides in a new Cold War between nuclear-armed blocs. Arms races would proliferate as nations sought to bolster their defenses in a world where nuclear weapons were no longer unthinkable. The United Nations, already weakened by internal divisions and a lack of enforcement power, would likely be rendered powerless to address the challenges of a nuclear-armed world. The dream of a rules-based international order, already fading, would be extinguished, replaced by a Hobbesian world, where might makes right and the strong prey on the weak. Section 11: Beyond the Abyss, Charting a Path to Nuclear Disarmament. The specter of nuclear war hangs heavy over the world. The crisis in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of unchecked aggression. Yet even in this dark hour, there is hope. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of nuclear war. Ukrainian citizen, the international community must seize this moment to reaffirm its commitment to nuclear disarmament and to create a world free from the threat of nuclear annihilation. This will require a concerted effort by all nations, nuclear-armed and non-nuclear alike, to reduce nuclear stockpiles, strengthen non-proliferation regimes, and address the underlying tensions that fuel nuclear competition. The path to a nuclear-free world will be long and arduous. It will require visionary leadership, unwavering political will, and the active engagement of civil society. But the alternative, a world consumed by nuclear fire, is simply unacceptable. The future of humanity depends on our collective wisdom and courage to choose a different path, a path of peace, dialogue, and mutual respect.